Hi guys, let's continue with part 2 of chapter 3, that is the nationalism in India. 2.3 Swaraj in the plantations. Workers too had their own understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion of Swaraj. For plantation workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely in and out of the confined space in which they were enclosed. So, for the plantation workers in Assam, freedom meant the right to move freely and in and out. So, the right to move freely in and out of the confined space in which they were enclosed, and it meant retaining a link with the village from which they had come. Under the Inland Immigration Act of 1859, plantation workers were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission, and in fact, they were rarely given such permission. When they heard of the non-cooperation movement, thousands of workers defied the authorities, left the plantations and headed home. They believed that Gandhi Raj was coming and everyone would be given land in their own villages. They, however, never reached their destination. Stranded on the way by the railway and steamer strike, they were caught by the police and brutally beaten up. The visions of these movements were not defined by the Congress program. So the visions of these movements were not defined by the Congress program. They interpreted the term Swaraj in their own ways, imagining it to be a time when all sufferings and all troubles would be over. Yet when the tribals chanted Gandhiji's name and raised slogans demanding Swatantra Bharat, they were also emotionally relating to an all India agitation. When they acted in the name of Mahatma Gandhi or linked their movement to that of the Congress, they were identifying with a movement which went beyond the limits of their immediate locality. Here is a figure. Figure 5. Chauri Chora 1922. At Chauri Chora in Gorakhpur, a peaceful demonstration in a bazaar turned into a violent clash with the police. Hearing of the incident, Mahatma Gandhi called a halt to the non-cooperation movement. Number 3. Towards civil disobedience. In February 1922, in February 1922, Mahatma Gandhi decided to withdraw the non-cooperation movement. He felt the movement was turning violent in many places and satyagrahis needed to be properly trained before they would be ready for mass struggles. Within the Congress, some leaders were by now tired of mass struggles and wanted to participate in elections to the provincial councils that had been set up by the Government of India Act of 1919. They felt that it was important to oppose British politics within the councils, argue for reform, and also demonstrate that these councils were not truly democratic. C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru formed the Swaraj Party. So C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru formed the Swaraj Party within the Congress to argue for a return to council politics. But younger leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose praised for more radical mass agitation and for full independence. In such a situation of internal debate and dissension, two factors again shaped Indian politics towards the late 1920s. The first was the effect of the worldwide economic depression. So, the first was the effect of the worldwide economic depression. Agricultural prices began to fall from 1926 and collapsed after 1930. As the demand for agricultural goods fell and exports declined, peasants found it difficult to sell their harvest and pay their revenue. By 1930, the countryside was in turmoil. Against this background, the new Tory government in Britain constituted a statutory commission. So, the Tory government in Britain constituted a statutory commission under Sir John Simon, set up in response to the nationalist movement. The commission was to look into the functioning of the constitutional system in India and suggest changes. The problem was that the Commission did not have a single Indian member, they were all British. When the Simon Commission arrived in India in 1928, so the Simon Commission arrived in India in 1928, it was greeted with the slogan, "Go back, Simon." All parties, including the Congress and the Muslim League, participated in the demonstrations. In an effort to win them over, the Viceroy, Lord Irwin, announced in October 1929 a vague offer of dominion status for India in an unspecified future and a round table conference to discuss a future constitution. This did not satisfy the Congress leaders. We have a figure here. Figure 6, Meeting of Congress Leaders at Allahabad, 1931. Apart from Mahatma Gandhi, you can see Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, extreme left, Jawaharlal Nehru in the extreme right, and Subhas Chandra Bose, fifth from right. Then the radicals within the Congress, led by Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose, became more assertive. The liberals and moderates who were opposing a constitutional system within the framework of British dominion gradually lost their influence. In December 1929, under the presidency of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Lahore Congress. So, in December 1929, under the presidency of Jawaharlal Nehru, the Lahore Congress formalized the demand of Purna Swaraj, or full independence of India. It was declared that 26 January 1930 would be celebrated as the Independence Day, when people were to take a pledge to struggle for complete independence. But the celebrations attracted very little attention, so Mahatma Gandhi had to find a way to relate this abstract idea of freedom to more concrete issues of everyday life. Source C. The Independence Day Pledge, 26 January 1930. We believe that it is the inalienable right of the Indian people, as of any other people, to have freedom and to enjoy the fruits of their toil and have the necessities of life, so that they may have full opportunities of growth. We believe also that if any government deprives a people of these rights and oppresses them, the people have a further right to alter it or to abolish it. The British government in India has not only deprived the Indian people of their freedom but has based itself on the exploitation of the masses and has ruined India economically, politically, culturally, and spiritually. We believe, therefore, that India must sever the British connection. We believe, therefore, that India must sever the British connection and attain Purna Swaraj or complete independence. 3.1 The Salt March and the Civil Disobedience Movement. Mahatma Gandhi found in salt a powerful symbol that could unite the nation. So, Mahatma Gandhi found in salt a powerful symbol that could unite the nation. On 31st January 1930, he sent a letter to Viceroy Irwin stating 11 demands. Some of these were of general interest, others were specific demands of different classes, from industrialists to peasants. The idea was to make the demands wide ranging so that all classes within Indian society could identify with them and everyone could be brought together in a united campaign. The most staring of all was the demand to abolish the salt tax. Salt was something consumed by the rich and the poor alike, and it was one of the most essential items of food. The tax on salt and the government monopoly over its production, Mahatma Gandhi declared, revealed the most oppressive face of British rule. Mahatma Gandhi's letter was in a way an ultimatum. If the demands were not fulfilled by 11th March, the letter stated, the Congress would launch a civil disobedience campaign. Irwin was unwilling to negotiate, so Mahatma Gandhi started his famous Salt March, accompanied by 78 of his trusted volunteers. The march was over 240 miles from Gandhiji's ashram in Sabarmati to the Gujarati coastal town of Dandi. The volunteers walked for 24 days, about 10 miles a day. Thousands came to hear Mahatma Gandhi wherever he stopped, and he told them what he meant by Swaraj and urged them to peacefully defy the British. On 6th April, he reached Dandi. So on 6th April, he reached Dandi and ceremonially violated the law, manufacturing salt by boiling sea water. This marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. How was this movement different from the non-cooperation movement? People were now asked not only to refuse cooperation. So people were now asked not only to refuse cooperation, but with the British as they had done in 1921-22, but also to break colonial laws. So the first one is that they should not cooperate with the British, and the second one is that they should break colonial laws. Here's a figure. Figure 7. The Dandi March. During the Salt March, Mahatma Gandhi was accompanied by 78 volunteers. On the way, they were joined by thousands. Thousands in different parts of the country broke the salt law, manufactured salt and demonstrated in front of government salt factories. As the movement spread, foreign cloth was boycotted. So foreign cloth was boycotted Liquor shops were picketed, peasants refused to pay revenue and chowkidari taxes. Village officials resigned, they resigned, and in many places forest people violated forest laws, going into reserved forest to collect wood and graze cattle. Worried by the developments, the colonial government began arresting the Congress leaders. So they arrested the Congress leaders. This led to violent clashes in many places. When Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, when Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a devout disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, was arrested in April 1930, angry crowds demonstrated in the streets of Peshawar, facing armored cars and police firing. Many were killed. A month later, when Mahatma Gandhi himself was arrested, industrial workers in Sholapur attacked police posts, municipal buildings, law courts, and railway stations, all structures that symbolized British rule. A frightened government responded with a policy of brutal repression. Peaceful satyagrahis were attacked, women and children were beaten, and about 100,000 people were arrested. In such a situation, Mahatma Gandhi once again decided to call off the movement and entered into a pact with Irvin on 5th March 1931. Here's a figure 8. Police crackdown on satyagrahis 1930. By this Gandhi-Irwin Pact, Gandhiji consented. Okay. By this Gandhi-Irwin Pact, Gandhiji consented to participate in a round-table conference. The Congress had boycotted the first round-table conference. Okay, so the Gandhiji accepted to participate in the round-table conference in London. So he is going to participate in the roundtable conference, and the government agreed to release the political prisoners. In December 1931, Gandhiji went. December 1931, Gandhiji went to London for the conference. But the negotiations broke down and he returned disappointed. Back in India, he discovered that the government had begun a new cycle of repression. Ghaffar Khan and Jawaharlal Nehru were both in jail. The Congress had been declared illegal and a series of measures had been imposed to prevent meetings, demonstrations, and boycotts. With great apprehension, Mahatma Gandhi relaunched the civil disobedience movement. For over a year the movement continued, but by 1934 it lost its momentum. We have a box here, box 1. To the altar of this revolution we have brought our youth as incense. To the altar of this revolution we have brought our youth as incense. Many nationalists thought that the struggle against the British could not be won through non-violence. In 1928, the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army (HSRA) was founded at a meeting in Firoz Shah Kotla ground in Delhi. Amongst its leaders were Bhagat Singh, Jatin Das, and Ajoy Ghosh. In a series of dramatic actions in different parts of India, the HSRA targeted some of the symbols of British power. In April 1929, Bhagat Singh and Batukeshwar Datta threw a bomb in the Legislative Assembly. In the same year, there was an attempt to blow up the train that Lord Irwin was travelling in. Bhagat Singh was 23 when he was tried and executed by the colonial government. During his trial, Bhagat Singh stated that he did not wish to glorify the cult of the bomb and pistol, but wanted a revolution in society. Revolution is the inalienable right of mankind. Freedom is the imprescriptible birthright of all. Revolution is the inalienable right of mankind. Freedom is the imprescriptible birthright of all. The laborer is the real sustainer of society. To the altar of this revolution we have brought our youth as incense. For no sacrifice is too great for so magnificent a cause. We are content. We await the advent of revolution. Inqilab Zindabad. 3.2 How participants saw the movement. Let us now look at the different social groups that participated in the civil disobedience movement. Why did they join the movement? What were their ideals? What did Swaraj mean to them? In the countryside, rich peasant communities like the Patidars of Gujarat and the Jats of Uttar Pradesh were active in the movement. Being producers of commercial crops, they were very hard hit by the trade depression and falling prices. As their cash income disappeared, they found it impossible to pay the government's revenue demand. And the refusal of the government to reduce the revenue demand led them to widespread resentment. So, what happened was that they were very hard hit by the trade depression and falling prices, and their income disappeared. And they found it impossible to pay the government's revenue demand. But the government refused to reduce the revenue demand and this led to widespread resentment. These rich peasants became enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement, organizing their communities and at times forcing reluctant members to participate in the boycott programs. For them, the fight for Swaraj was a struggle against high revenues, but they were deeply disappointed when the movement was called off in 1931 without the revenue rates being revised. So when the movement was restarted in 1932, many of them refused to participate. The poorer peasantry were not just interested in the lowering of the revenue demand. Many of them were small tenants cultivating land they had rented from landlords. As the depression continued and cash incomes dwindled, the small tenants found it difficult to pay their rent. They wanted the unpaid rent of the landlord to be remitted. They joined a variety of radical movements, often led by socialists and communists. Apprehensive of raising issues that might upset the rich peasants and landlords, the Congress was unwilling to support no rent campaigns in most places. So the relationship between the poor peasant and the Congress remained uncertain. So the Congress was unwilling to support the no rent campaign because they were worried that it might upset the rich peasants and landlords. What about the business classes? How did they relate to the civil disobedience movement? During the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists had made huge profits and become powerful. So, what happened during the First World War? During the First World War, Indian merchants and industrialists had made huge profits and become powerful. Keen on expanding their business, they now reacted against colonial policies that restricted business activities. They wanted protection against imports of foreign goods and a rupee sterling foreign exchange ratio that would discourage imports. To organize business interest, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920. So to organize business interest, they formed the Indian Industrial and Commercial Congress in 1920 and the Federation of the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries FICCI in 1927. Led by prominent industrialists like Purushottam Das, Thakur Das, and G.D. Birla, the industrialists attacked colonial control over the Indian economy and supported the civil disobedience movement when it was first launched. They gave financial assistance and refused to buy or sell imported goods. Most businessmen came to see Swaraj as a time when colonial restrictions on business would no longer exist and trade and industry would flourish without constraints. But after the failure of the Round Table Conference, business groups were no longer uniformly enthusiastic. They were apprehensive of the spread of militant activities and worried about prolonged disruption of business, as well as of the growing influence of socialism amongst the younger members of the Congress. The industrial working classes did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in large numbers. So, the industrial working classes did not participate in the civil disobedience movement in large numbers, except in the Nagpur region. As the industrialists came closer to the Congress, workers stayed aloof. But in spite of that, some workers did participate in the civil disobedience movement, selectively adopting some of the ideas of the Gandhian program, like boycott of foreign goods, as part of their own movements against low wages and poor working conditions. There were strikes by railway workers in 1930 and dock workers in 1932. In 1930, thousands of workers in Chota Nagpur tin mines wore Gandhi capes and participated in protest rallies and boycott campaigns. But the Congress was reluctant to include workers' demands as part of its program of struggle. It felt that this would alienate. So they felt that this would alienate industrialists and divide the anti imperial forces. Another important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large scale participation of women. So, in the civil disobedience movement, large scale participation of women can be seen. During Gandhiji's Salt March, thousands of women came out of their homes to listen to him. So here are some important dates. 1918 to 19. Distressed UP peasants organized by Baba Ramchandra. April 1919, Gandhian Hartal against Rowlatt Act, Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Then January 1921, Non-Cooperation and Khilafat movement launched. February 1922, Chauri Chaura, Gandhiji withdraws non-cooperation movement. May 1924, Alluri Sitarama Raju arrested, ending a 2-year armed tribal struggle. December 1929, Lahore Congress. Congress adopts the demand for Purna Swaraj. 1930, Ambedkar establishes Depressed Classes Association. March 1930, Gandhiji begins civil disobedience movement by breaking salt law at Dandi. March 1931, Gandhiji ends civil disobedience movement. December 1931, Second Roundtable Conference. 1932, civil disobedience relaunched. So the women, they participated in protest marches, manufactured salt, and picketed foreign clothes and liquor shops. Many went to jail. In urban areas, these women were from high caste families. In rural areas, they came from rich peasant households. Here's a figure. Figure 9. Women joined nationalist processions. During the national movement, many women, for the first time in their lives, moved out of their homes onto a public arena. Amongst the marches, you can see many old women and mothers with children in their arms. Moved by Gandhiji's call, they began to see service to the nation as a sacred duty of women. Yet this increased public role did not necessarily mean any radical change in the way the position of women was visualized. Gandhiji was convinced that it was the duty of women to look after home and hearth. Gandhiji was convinced that it was the duty of women to look after home and hearth and be good mothers and good wives. So he believed that the duty of women is to look after home and hearth and be good mothers and good wives. And for a long time, the Congress was reluctant to allow women to hold any position of authority within the organization. It was keen only on their symbolic presence. So let's continue in the next video. Bye guys.